adults growing up in a cultural dynamic that was based on honor and shame. And so we all know that we all have a certain cultural perspective that dominates the world around us. In the West, it's very common a guilt versus justice culture, very more independent driven versus a lot of the world is a little more communal. And with that comes the shame and honor perspective of culture. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. There's just a different dynamic. And understanding it is actually very helpful in understanding, at least for me, it was very helpful in understanding where my mom was coming from and how she raised us. Because her family dynamic was very much based on honor and shame. When we lived in Russia, I had my third child there, and I experienced somewhat of that shame honor culture in a sense where I didn't see anything wrong with him. However, the doctor felt like he needed to build on muscle strength and have a massage, and certain medications need to be taken before she would give an approval for immunizations. And so I struggled through this. I didn't want to give the medications that she was prescribing because I didn't find it necessary. And so in my individualistic type of approach, I told her to her face that I wasn't giving the medications. And with that, I dishonored her position. At the time, I didn't realize what I was doing. But with now understanding a little more of this honor shame dynamic, I should have not come directly at her and spoken with such bluntness. Instead, it should have been done in a more indirect way. My Russian friends later on advised me that I should have just flushed the medications and pretended like I was giving them. And so, as long as I wasn't caught in that culture, I would be okay. If I was directly saying I'm not giving them, then I'm shaming a person that has been given a position of honor, such as a doctor, a teacher, or other positions. So the Mennonite background that I come from, and most of us come from that are listening to this, come from more of a Slavic perspective. And so this definitely has affected our forefathers and how they were raised and how they raised their kids. And sometimes I think it's caused some clashes between families because of not understanding why certain, not shunnings, but maybe coldness has happened when certain things have been spoken. And I do believe that the cultural dynamics of the West and the East have clashed in our families. I can see how difficult it would have been for our grandparents or great grandparents to come to North America and to immerse their children into more of an individualistic type thinking, and yet them still functioning under what does the community approve? Because honor shame is very much based on a communal type thinking. The community approves certain statuses. They want to see certain behaviors. They want to see you do it together as a group, and it's not an individual based approach. To go against this status would be cause great shame to the perpetrator or the family. So everyone in this communal cultural mindset has an obligation to strive to meet that standard because that has been approved for generations, or it's been approved through the leaders of that community. Looking back, I was exposed to this, even though I didn't realize what was happening early on when we first moved to Paraguay, and I was in fifth grade. That was a significant change for me in schooling. The languages changed. I was no longer receiving my instruction in English. Now it changed to German and Spanish. And most of the kids in the classroom still predominantly spoke German to each other, which I understood and I could speak. However, I had not done any academic work really with it. But the other thing that was a significant change was the authoritarian approach to teaching. It was very teacher directed, and the teacher carried with him at all times a stick. If the stick broke, then he'd have one of the kids in the classroom go find another stick, carve it up, and get it ready. It wasn't sharp. It was just a good branch that had been debarked, and he'd carry it with him. And it was used to point at the board, point at maps, tap at the table to get our attention. However, there were times when it was used in another manner. For example, sometimes he would also use it to tap on the table to get our focus back onto his teaching up front. However, if people were disrespectful and continued talking or laughing, it would be used in a little more violent way, which sometimes would really catch us off guard and shock everybody. So the cultural shift was somewhat changing already to a little more, people were a little more advocating for themselves, more so than maybe in years previous to this. But everyone knew we couldn't push the teacher's button too far or we would get smacked with a stick. One of these times, the teacher actually embarrassed one of the students up front and said something about him needing to see a doctor due to some illness or he wasn't looking good. And that really embarrassed this boy, I remember. And soon's notes started being passed around in class, kind of making derogatory comments about the teacher. And it didn't take long for a few boys to just start giggling and couldn't help themselves. And all of a sudden, the teacher just came and whipped each one of them on the back with his stick. And we were just all sitting in shock of what just happened. And I remember just going through life with that, thinking that was really random. Why would a teacher use a stick to gain control and student engagement? However, this time around in Paraguay, my oldest uncle shared something with me that I'd never heard before. And it just made some of this just make sense where this teacher was coming from. Because according to my uncle, this teaching style of authoritarian, like a certain position of honor, was enforced in the early days of the Mennonites in the Chaco. So he's going on 90. So, and the Mennonites have been there now about 95 years. So he experienced some of those early methods of schooling and how strict the teachers were. He tells of a story when he and his buddies were upset with the teacher and they were walking down the road heading home after a day of school and just sharing some inappropriate remarks about the teacher. And the little girl, lo and behold, behind them, heard the conversation and told the teacher what she had heard. Following morning, as the students began arriving at school, they noticed that a rope was being soaked in a bucket just outside the school house. And they knew that somebody was going to be punished that day at school. Didn't realize that it was going to be the five of them. Once everyone had gathered in the little schoolhouse and the morning routines of standing and greeting the teacher had happened appropriately, the teacher called the five boys up front who had been told on for speaking disrespectfully of the teacher, and he explained what had been said and asked the first boy to remove his shirt. The wet rope was held high, and the teacher whipped the boy several times across his back. And the spectators sitting on their school benches, taking in all the boys crying and processing this emotion. But once the teacher deemed that the strokes were enough, the next boy was asked to take position in the same way by taking off his shirt, and lashings and cries filled the air and making it unbearable for the next boy in line. Let's call that boy Peter. As Peter was panicking about what was going to be happening, and that he was going to be up next, he came up with a strategy to possibly find some compassion from the teacher. So once the lashing had finished and the wounded boy found his shirt and sat down crying, Peter was called up to take his place at the whipping block. And he mustered up the courage and pleaded for mercy. He begged the teacher. In German, he said, Herr Lehrer, können Sie mir es verzeihen? He's in English, so the teacher, could you please forgive me? When the teacher saw the sincerity in his eyes, he actually responded with, yes, you are forgiven. And with that, the next two boys requested the same plea, and they were granted forgiveness and weren't whipped. When I asked if they had gone home to tell about this or what the parents said, my uncle was like, no, we didn't share that with our parents. That kind of an occurrence stayed at school. None of their transgressions were shared with the family at home around the dinner table. And since the teacher held a place of honor and respect, as parents, you would not go against his judgment. But instead, you'd support him in order to keep shame from the family by giving your child another lashing at home. So the kids, in order to spare themselves more punishment, they just went home and they kept this whole thing to themselves. The parents never heard about it. My question is, what generation of your family may have experienced this? And how has it come to play in the next generation? I still see it come to play in somewhat of a clash in the Chaco. I think it's becoming more and more so as maybe more of an individualistic culture is blooming in that area due to the internet and social media. Much more of a voice is coming out. It's causing somewhat of a clash. It's interesting. Some of the comments that I've heard that now reflect this kind of a shame honor culture is, they might say things like, they think differently than we do, or Zijn dat onze mensen? In Low German, that would mean, are those of our people? The mentality of them and us really comes up in a shame honor culture because it's, I guess, a way of processing of how we do it and how they do it. I would love to hear more about how you may have experienced shame and honor in your family. And I will be talking more about it because this is a topic that intrigues me as I process it and as I write about it. I'd love to share it with you.